I caught my husband with my son's fiancée. I was in shock when I discovered she was. The day I found out about my husband's betrayal with my son's fiancée, my world turned upside down. It was as if all the roles in my life had been torn before my eyes. Wife, mother, woman. The pain was so great that I thought I couldn't bear it. But what came after that shock led me on a much deeper journey. A journey of rediscovering myself, of faith, and of rebuilding. Today, I look back and see that wound led me down an unexpected path. I learned that pain can be a starting point, and that some losses, however cruel they may seem, make room for truth and for a stronger new beginning than any dream I've ever had. I'm so happy you're here. Follow my story to the end and comment what city you're following from. I want to know how far my story of pain and overcoming has reached. I had developed the habit of looking away whenever I passed a mirror. They showed me more than just blemishes. They revealed everything I didn't want to be. In the reflection, there was a version of me that no one chooses to befriend, who goes unnoticed in crowds and becomes the subject of whispers. I learned to walk looking at the ground, to dress like someone who doesn't want attention. Amidst the chaos, Dr. Whitaker's office seemed like a minefield of false hopes. At each appointment I prepared to hear more of the same, until he uttered the phrase that would knock me off my feet. "You will need these medications forever." That sentence felt like a real judgment. Forever echoed in me as if it were the end of all possibilities. I didn't cry there, I just nodded, took the prescription and left. It felt like the future had closed itself in a cold, windowless metal box. It wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about control, about never being able to dream of lightness again. When I got home, I dropped my bag on the floor and stared at the ceiling for long minutes. I didn't want to talk, I didn't want to be comforted, I just wanted to disappear. That night, I tried to imagine a way anyway, but everything seemed like a labyrinth that ended in the same place. Frustration. It was as if my body had decided that living in war was the only way. Hope, poor thing, had already packed its bags. I felt trapped in a destiny I didn't choose, as if there was a broken promise between me and life. Even while sleeping, the echoes of the phrase returned. Forever. 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 But in the middle of the night, a question began to haunt me, small as a seed. What if it wasn't about curing myself but about finding another way to live? I had no answers, only fear. But I also knew that continuing like this was dying in installments. I remained silent, staring into the darkness, trying to understand how to move forward. How do you live when the future looks like a cell? The next day, the world continued indifferent. At work, glances darted and returned quickly, but not without leaving their marks. Jokes came softly, disguised as teasing. "Oh wow, winter really got you." Or "Have you tried that new cream from TV?" They were invisible shots that pierced deep. I smiled mechanically, answered what was necessary, and pretended not to care. No one knew, but every word hit like a reminder that I wasn't enough even to go unnoticed. At home, the scene was no longer welcoming. My mother tried to cheer me up with ready-made phrases, advice that seemed taken from old magazines. "You're beautiful in your own way," she would say, but her eyes betrayed her concern. Sometimes she came with solutions that seemed more like condemnations. "Maybe you should just accept this, daughter." She wanted to help, but the way she did made me feel even more fragile. Her love came full of fear, and that hurt me. Routine was a mixture of escape and effort to maintain some dignity. I dressed as if by choice, but in reality it was to hide. I put makeup on the parts one could, covered the parts one couldn't. I made excuses to avoid meetings and gatherings. Living became a theater where I acted as someone functional, while inside it was just chaos. The mirror remained covered with a blue cloth, and I pretended it didn't make a difference. Even so, I carried on. Sometimes I smiled to reassure my mother, so she would stop watching me like someone watching a cracked vase about to fall. But my greatest effort was to appear normal at work, so no one would see what was crumbling. Sometimes I convinced myself that I could endure anything, that it was just another phase. Until, alone in my room, the silence told the truth I didn't want to face. I smiled on the outside. Inside I collapsed. It was on a cloudy afternoon that Mia appeared with her energy that always seemed to defy the weather. She entered without knocking, as she always did, and hugged me as if she knew what I couldn't say. We sat on the floor of my room and she listened without interrupting. When I finished, her eyes were firm but gentle. Let's do things differently, she said. And she introduced me to the idea of a 6-month cycle. Weekly photos, daily prayer, and intentional self-care. Like a silent pact of hope. First, I hesitated. It seemed naive to think that something so simple could compete with diagnoses and definitive medications. But there was something in the way Mia spoke that made me want to try. She brought a notebook, a small pot of cream, and a faith I had forgotten existed. It would be 6 months of trying with no guarantees, just surrender. Not for immediate healing but for peace, for regaining control. She helped me organize the space. We removed the cloth from the mirror, put soft lighting, chose a fixed time. It became almost a ritual, even though I wasn't sure if I truly believed. Mia didn't force anything. She just said that, even if everything failed, I would have treated myself with kindness for 6 months. And that alone would be worth it. It was strange but comforting. For the first time, something seemed to be under my control. I wrote on the last page of the notebook the phrase she wrote in her firm handwriting. 6 months. Not a day more. I looked at it like someone looking at a promise. And I committed silently. 6 months. Not a day more. The first visit to Pastor Elijah happened more due to Mia's insistence than my own initiative. He welcomed us with that serene smile that doesn't try to convince, just embraces. We sat in a circle and he asked me how I felt, not physically but in my soul. I didn't know how to answer. It was then that he proposed something beyond formal prayer. That I talk to God as one talks to a friend. That I not spare the ugly parts, the doubts, the weariness. Because faith, he said, is not the absence of fear. It is following even while trembling. I began to think of it as an exercise. I didn't need to look beautiful for God, nor have ready answers. He wanted to hear what hurt, even if it was anger. Pastor Elijah said that God can handle our questions. That prayer is less about asking and more about trusting. His proposal was simple, but it disarmed me. What if I really told him everything? Without censorship, without embellishment? The idea of an honest conversation with the divine moved me in a way I didn't understand at the time. I returned home carrying more questions than solutions. But there was also a spark ignited. Maybe it wasn't about changing the diagnosis but about changing what it did to me. That night, I wrote my first letter to God. It was a confused text with errors and scribbles, but it came straight from my heart. Then I applied the cream as if offering care to a frightened child. It wasn't healing yet, but it felt like a beginning. Faith is not blindness. It is trusting even when everything seems dark. The following days took on a new rhythm. Every night at the same time, I calmly applied the cream, prayed softly, and wrote in my journal. It wasn't always pretty. Sometimes I could only write one sentence, sometimes I just cried. But I didn't skip the ritual. The repetition began to create a strange kind of security, as if my body was understanding that it was no longer alone. The mirror was now uncovered. Not because I felt ready, but because I decided to stop hiding from myself. The journal was taking shape, full of confused thoughts, gratitude lists, whispered requests. The photos Mia took every Sunday were hard to face. I saw every detail magnified, every mark I tried to forget. But I also saw the courage I didn't know I had. Some nights were harder than others, and my desire was to throw everything away. But the routine held me. Even if I saw no change, something inside me was stirring. But no one prepared me for what came next. 2 weeks after starting, my skin reacted unexpectedly. The blemishes became more intense, painful, and red. It was as if my body was punishing me for believing too much. I looked in the mirror with anger, like someone facing an enemy. Despair returned with force. I wanted to tear up the photos, hide the notebook, give up everything. It was unfair. I was doing everything right and the result was worse than before. It seemed like a cruel joke from the universe. Mia tried to calm me, saying that such reactions were common at the beginning of many treatments. Pastor Elijah reminded me that even the desert has a purpose. But my strength was draining fast. On the 3rd night of the crisis, I sat on the bathroom floor and cried in silence. Not out of vanity but out of exhaustion. It was as if I was spending everything I had inside and nothing was changing on the outside. I felt foolish for having believed. And very, very alone. Even so, that night I didn't break the cycle. I performed the ritual crying, writing almost without seeing the lines. Maybe it was out of pride or out of fear of regretting it later. Maybe out of a stubborn faith that hadn't died yet. But deep down I felt that something had changed. Not on my skin but in the way I reacted to pain. For the first time I didn't give up at the height of the fall. But it still hurt too much. Was it all in vain? Mia wouldn't accept my idea of stopping the photos. On the contrary, she doubled the frequency. She said that it was precisely on bad days that the record was most necessary. I reluctantly accepted, but the camera seemed to weigh more than any skin pain. She adjusted the light, the angle, and asked me to look. I looked away, squinted, held back tears. It was torture to see it all frozen on the screen. Even so, I allowed it. Perhaps because deep down I knew there was something important there. The images told a story that my memory alone couldn't sustain. Mia said that, one day, I would see not just the marks, but the courage. In the first few clicks I only saw what I always saw, flaws. But she saw beyond, and her borrowed hope kept me standing. Each session was brief but intense. One night I looked at a sequence of 3 photos, one from the beginning, another from a few days ago, and the last one from that week. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but something seemed to have changed. The redness was not as vivid. Still, I feared I was hallucinating out of desire. The mind can deceive, especially when the heart is thirsty. Mia held my hand and said that any step, however small, was movement. Maybe that was it. Keep walking, even if crawling. Gradually, I realized that recording the pain was also a way to validate it. I wasn't exaggerating nor being weak. I was fighting. Each photo hurt, yes. But it also said, you are here. You are trying. Each click of the camera was an act of courage. It was on a weekend that Rachel appeared. My cousin, full of certainties, always dressed in convictions, always carrying Bible verses on the tip of her tongue. She sat in front of me like someone who comes to save a soul, not to listen to a heart. She spoke of trials, of faith that moves mountains, and of punishments that purify. I remained silent, but inside something trembled. Not because of the words, but because of the way they pierced me carelessly. She said everything in a sweet tone, but her phrases hit me like a hammer. Maybe you need to repent of something, she blurted out, and my stomach churned. I never asked to carry this body, this skin, these wounds. And now that was guilt? Guilt for what? I tried to explain my process, the cycle, the honest prayers. She shook her head, like someone hearing heresy disguised as hope. The feeling was of being judged for believing in the wrong way. After she left, I sat in silence for a long time. I felt anger but also sadness. Because part of me still wanted to please, to be accepted. Even by those who hurt me without realizing it. Rachel's words reopened doubts I was trying to bury. Was my faith weak? Was this effort in vain? Did God also look at me strangely as she did? I took a deep breath and walked to the mirror. The same one now uncovered that exposed me night after night. I looked firmly, not to see blemishes, but to remember who I was. I remembered what Pastor Elijah said. God listens to the heart, not the performance. My faith might be imperfect, but it was real. And that was enough. Not everyone who talks about faith helps keep it alive. That night I knelt down as I had so many other times, but the words didn't come immediately. I didn't ask for healing, I didn't beg for miracles. I just allowed myself to feel. And I cried. I cried like someone opening the windows after a long storm. I spoke to God like someone writing to a distant but intimate friend. I said I was tired, that it hurt too much, but that I didn't want to give up. I asked for something simple. Strength to continue, even when everything seemed to crumble. There was no audible response, no mystical warmth. But there was a strange, subtle peace that settled over me like a light blanket. I wiped my face, finished the ritual, and lay down. For the first time in a long time, I didn't toss and turn in bed thinking about the next day. I just closed my eyes and let sleep take me. The pain was still there. So were the doubts. But something inside me had quieted. I thought about the photos, the prayers, Rachel's clumsy words, Mia's sweet words. Each of them shaped me in some way. I was rebuilding myself not despite the pain but because of it. That's what perhaps no one understood. Sometimes what seems like weakness is, in fact, resistance. I slept with that idea pounding in my head. That night I slept in peace for the first time. It was on the 29th day that I noticed something new. As I applied the cream, I noticed that the skin's texture seemed less inflamed. There was less itching, less burning. It was so subtle that I doubted myself. But I compared it with one of the initial photos and the contrast was there. Small but present. My heart pounded not with joy but with fear. Because along with the improvement came the fear that it would disappear the next day. I spent hours observing the details in the mirror, as if I could capture some confirmation. I didn't tell my mother or Mia. I wanted to keep it just for myself, like someone hiding a fragile secret. During the day I touched my face several times, as if I needed to remind myself that it was real. But my mind played tricks. Was it just too much wanting to see change? Was my desire distorting my perception? Even so, that night the prayer was different. I gave thanks cautiously, afraid to celebrate too early. But I gave thanks. It was the first time my prayer had more gratitude than supplication. It was strange, almost uncomfortable. I no longer knew how to pray without pain. Writing in my journal was also lighter. The words flowed with timid but firm hope. It was the first sign that perhaps, just perhaps, something was truly changing. Was it real? Or just my wish to see it? I returned to Dr. Whitaker's office at the beginning of the second month. He examined me carefully, measured distances between lesions, noted data. His face maintained that medical neutrality, but at a certain point, his expression changed. Slightly, almost imperceptibly, like someone who saw something unexpected. He asked if I had changed anything in the treatment. I only replied that I was being more careful with my routine. He nodded but said nothing more. It was clear that he didn't expect to see what he saw. It was still early, and fluctuation is common, he said. But there was something there that made him curious. He spoke of continuing to observe, without creating expectations. But I saw a hint of doubt in his eyes, as if something didn't fit. That gave me a strange kind of joy. Not because I doubted him, but because even the skeptics were starting to notice. I left the clinic with a light heart. Mia was waiting for me at the coffee shop on the corner, and we celebrated with hot tea and nervous laughter. I showed her the photo from the last week and she compared it with the previous one. For the first time, she didn't need to say anything. We both saw it. It was discreet but real. The silent routine was taking effect. Even if timid, that progress was mine. And no one could take it away. He frowned. But he didn't say anything. That night we marked the symbolic date. The last day of the cycle. June 30th. Mia took a golden pen and drew a circle around the day on the calendar. The image was etched in my mind as a distant but possible goal. Having a deadline gave me focus but also fear. Because what if everything crumbled the next day? What if my skin inflamed again as soon as I stopped with the cream? Even so, I decided. I wrote in my journal firmly, I will go until the end. Not because I was sure, but because I needed to believe in something. Each day, I followed the routine with more attention. The moments in front of the mirror became more bearable. I began to see not only blemishes but also resistance, perseverance. It wasn't vanity. It was dignity. I deserved this care. And I deserved to try until the last day. Mia hugged me tightly and said that, come what may, she would be with me. I just nodded, trying to hide the fear. There were still weeks ahead, but now everything seemed more concrete. I had a destination marked. A decision sealed. And every choice requires courage. Even the silent ones. What if everything returns the next day? Rachel appeared without warning. Like someone who feels entitled to rescue what she believes to be lost. She sat in the living room with a Bible on her lap and eyes full of judgment. She said she had heard about my spiritual experiment, and that it was playing with God. Her voice was calm, but her language cut like ice. She spoke of fear, obedience, of not trying to manipulate the heavens. And I, sitting in front of her, just listened in silence. Her words weighed more because they came from a family member. Every phrase was a reminder that not all love knows how to embrace. Part of me wanted to retort, to scream that she didn't know what I felt at night, the tearful prayers that contained despair. But I didn't answer. I took a deep breath and let her talk until she tired. Perhaps because I knew that arguing would be useless. Perhaps because my heart was too busy fighting to stay whole. Rachel finished with advice that sounded more like a sentence. Don't play with faith, Hannah. God is not a laboratory. And she left as she arrived, firm, without waiting for an answer. I closed the door with trembling hands and leaned my forehead against the wood. My chest burned, but my mouth remained closed. I knew what I was doing. I knew the pact I had made with God. A pact of care, not of bargaining. Even so, it was hard not to feel guilty. The urge to give up returned that night, whispering that maybe she was right. But I remembered my journey, the photos, the journal, the faith built in the dark. I remembered that my conversation with God wasn't about a miracle, but about truth. And, above all, it was about love, and love isn't imposed. I chose silence. But inside I trembled. The following week, in the middle of the afternoon, I was called to Mr. Davis's office. I walked with a tight stomach, as if every step was a test. He waited for me seated, hands crossed on the table, his gaze attentive. I thought I was going to receive some criticism, but his first sentence took me by surprise. "I want to say I've been noticing you." He wasn't referring to my appearance, but to my demeanor, to my presence, to my focus. He said that, in recent weeks, my concentration seemed greater, that my work was more consistent. He commented that many go through difficulties without anyone noticing, but that he saw it, even if he didn't say anything, and that there was something different about me. I thanked him without knowing what to say. It was strange to be seen from the inside, especially in a place where I had always tried to be invisible. Suddenly, my silent transformation began to radiate. I left the room somewhat dazed. Not by the compliment, but by the confirmation that something in me had indeed changed. There were still marks on my face, but another mark was emerging. That of someone who resisted. Mr. Davis didn't know about my cycle, nor about the nights in prayer. But he felt the reflection of it, even without understanding. That's what Mia said. What we plant in silence one day blossoms, even if no one sees the effort of the root. I took a deep breath and returned to my place. I watched my hands on the keyboard. They trembled slightly, as if they still doubted the strength they carried. But they were there, firm, active, moving forward. I knew how much I had fought for that moment of balance. And even if no one saw the battle, it existed, alive within me. The change began on the outside. But no one saw the inner war. June 30th arrived with the weight of a promise fulfilled. I woke up early without hunger, with my heart racing. I touched the bottle on the dresser like someone touching a sacred object. It wasn't an enemy, but it was no longer my guide either. For 6 months it was a symbol of routine, hope, fear. Now it was just a container. I prayed on my knees with sweaty hands and teary eyes. I asked for nothing. I just gave thanks for having made it this far. I closed the bottle, wrapped it in a white cloth, and put it in the drawer. I locked it like sealing a cycle. Mia arrived shortly after with coffee and a contained smile. We didn't talk much. She just looked at me with that way she has of understanding everything without needing to ask. The calendar marked the date circled in gold. It was strange how a number could carry so much weight. I had done my part. Now the rest no longer depended on me. That night, the ritual was quieter than ever. No cream, no touch. Just prayer and journaling. I wrote little. Just one sentence. Today I didn't finish a treatment. I finished a promise. I turned off the light and lay down. Every heartbeat seemed to scream. What if everything came back tomorrow? What if I had been too naive? But there was also peace, timid, filling the empty spaces of doubt. It was like walking in the dark after lighting a candle. I closed my eyes and let time do what it does, pass. There was nothing more to do, nothing more to control. It was just waiting. But this waiting tasted of faith. Now it was just me, God, and time. The first week without the medication passed like a held breath. I woke up every day and ran to the mirror with my heart in my hands. But there were no changes. No improvement, no worsening. Just the same skin, the same features. The absence of pain was comforting, but the absence of progress hurt in a different way. I wanted signs. I wanted anything that would tell me I wasn't regressing. But time only offered silence. I performed the nightly ritual as always, but now without the physical touch. It felt strange to pray without applying the cream. I felt incomplete, as if I was breaking a part of the pact. Even so, I continued. I wrote even when the words seemed empty. There were days when I only put the date and a period. Other days when I cried on the paper. Faith was still there, but hesitant, in a state of waiting. Every different sound on my skin made me imagine the worst. A stronger itch, a new redness, a slight burning. The fear was constant, subtle but present. Like a whisper in the back of my mind telling me that I shouldn't have stopped. That I was risking too much. But there was also something saying that courage sometimes is indeed silent. That resisting without certainty is one of the purest forms of faith. Fear was a constant whisper. My mother began to notice my restlessness. One night, during dinner, she looked at me with a frown and blurted out, "Are you sure about what you're doing, Hannah?" I swallowed hard. I said yes, that everything was under control. But she didn't seem convinced. She tried to soften her tone, but the concern was visible. "You know you don't need to prove anything to anyone, don't you?" I knew. But this wasn't about others. It was about me. About honoring the path I chose even if no one understood. My mother just wanted to protect me. She saw risk where I saw resistance. But how to explain that stopping now would be like denying everything I had built so far? She didn't see my nights in prayer, my silent battles. She only saw the danger of a return, of a relapse of frustration. And her love came disguised as caution. After dinner, we sat together in the living room. She held my hand and remained silent. There was nothing more to say. Deep down, she knew I wouldn't go back. And I knew her fear was disguised love. At that moment, neither of us won. We just coexisted on different sides of the same uncertainty. And that, in itself, was a form of reconciliation. She didn't see courage. She saw risk. I decided to visit Pastor Elijah at the end of that week. I sat on a pew in the empty church and waited until he approached with his usual calm demeanor. I told him about the absence of symptoms, about the fear of stagnation, about the voice of doubt that returned. He listened without interrupting. Then he said something that kept pounding in my head. "Trust, but also observe. God speaks with signs, but you need to have your eyes open." I explained that I felt lost between waiting and anxiety, and he replied with a simple question. "Are you just waiting for improvement? Or are you available to learn, even if it doesn't come?" I remained silent. He didn't offer formulas or ready answers. He just reminded me that faith and observation walk together. That trust in God doesn't exclude an attentive look at life's details. That night, I arrived home with a new kind of quietude. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the acceptance of doubt. I continued the routine as always, but more attentive. I looked in the mirror like someone looking not just for flaws but for clues. And it was then that I noticed something. An almost imperceptible detail, but different. Not on my skin but in my gaze. My own gaze. Less burdened. Less tired. It wasn't healing. But it was a sign. And sometimes that's how God answers. And the sign came from where I least expected it. I sat on the examination table with my heart pounding, my eyes avoiding the side mirror. Dr. Whitaker entered as always. Folders in hand, concentrated expression, clinical silence. He asked me to expose the lesion area, took the measuring tape and began to measure. His hands moved with their usual precision, but something in him seemed hesitant. He observed more than he spoke. And at one point he frowned. With each new point examined, time seemed to slow down. He compared the data with previous notes, turned pages, made new markings. But he still said nothing. I was tense, waiting for the verdict, but what made me restless was the silence. Finally, he stepped back, crossed his arms, and looked at me with a mixture of caution and surprise. He said that, although the results were not yet conclusive, there was clear improvement. The curious thing was that his words were neutral, but his eyes couldn't hide it. His demeanor remained protocol, but there was something he couldn't process. Perhaps a break in the logic he so trusted. He picked up the medical record, made quick notes, and murmured something about returning soon to talk further. When he left the room, I was alone for a few seconds trying to understand what it all meant. I slowly ran my hand over my face and felt my skin calmer. I looked at the ceiling, as if it were possible to extract answers from there. The doubt was still strong, but there was something different about that exam. Something even he didn't want to admit. His expression didn't match his words. A few minutes later, he returned with a new chart in his hands and said he wanted me to have a complete battery of tests. He said he needed to better understand what was happening, and emphasized that it was only as a precaution. He stated that such rapid changes were unusual, and that it was important to check everything. I just nodded, trying to process his subtext. In truth, he was intrigued. I took the referral and left the room with a mixture of apprehension and hope. Mia was waiting outside and stood up as soon as she saw me. I handed her the papers and explained in a few words. She smiled with shining eyes and said that was a good sign. But my mind was still in conflict. If even the doctor couldn't explain it, was it real? On the way home, I sat in silence in the passenger seat. I felt my heart like a drum inside my chest. It was as if I was living in an interval between two realities, that of past pain and that of possible healing. But doubt was a persistent companion. Mia respected my silence, just held my hand as she drove. It was the most accurate gesture she could have made. We arrived home and before sleeping I wrote in my journal, "I am in the middle of the mystery." I asked for nothing that night, just gave thanks. Something was changing, of that I was sure. Something out of the ordinary is happening, isn't it? The next day I had all the requested exams. Blood imaging, skin, all calmly and patiently. The results would take a few days, but every minute was an eternity. I continued the routine as in previous months, even without the cream. I slept poorly, woke up early, prayed more than I spoke. I didn't ask for healing. Only that God would prepare me to accept whatever came, no matter what. During the day, I occupied my mind with work, but the waiting gnawed at me. Mia followed everything closely, trying to distract me, telling jokes, making me coffee. At night, the room returned to being my silent sanctuary. I wrote as a way to exorcise thoughts. It was difficult not to create expectations, but it was also impossible not to fear a fall. After all, I already knew the pain of frustration. Every morning, I looked in the mirror searching for something different, or the same. I observed my skin with an almost obsessive minuteness. Part of me wanted to believe that everything had changed. Another part was terrified of discovering it was an illusion. In my prayers I was sincere. I asked for strength not to win but to endure. Because even victory can be frightening when you've never known what it's like to win. And then I wrote the phrase that hurt the most in that notebook. I prayed to accept any answer. Because it was no longer about control nor a miracle. It was about trusting. I prayed to accept any answer. 2 days later I received the call. Dr. Whitaker asked me to return to the office. He said he already had the results. His voice was different. Less cold, more thoughtful. I went with Mia, in silence, like someone walking towards the unexpected. I sat in the same chair as always, took a deep breath and waited. He came in, greeted me and went straight to the point. The exams show complete remission. For a second I didn't understand. He repeated. There were no signs of inflammatory activity, no active lesions, no residual indications. Everything clear. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his fingers and confessed that he couldn't explain it. Neither scientifically nor statistically. He said he had never seen a case like mine. Especially without continuous use of the medication. He remained silent for a few seconds, like someone trying to fit a piece that doesn't exist. I looked at Mia, then at him. It hadn't sunk in yet. It was all so calm. No movie scene, no background music. Just news whispered in a clinical tone. But my chest began to burn. Not with pain, with something new. Something that felt like freedom. Dr. Whitaker repeated, almost voicelessly. I've never seen anything like it. That, coming from him, was almost a miracle in itself. Mia began to cry, squeezing my hand. Inside I was still digesting every word. But something in me already knew. That phrase would be remembered forever. He stammered. I've never seen anything like this. When we left the clinic the world seemed the same. The streets, the people, the sky. But something in me was new. There was silence within me, but it was a different silence. Not of fear, but of gratitude. I sat on a bench in the square with Mia and cried in silence. Tears streamed down without a fuss, as if washing away entire months of anguish. She said nothing, just hugged me. It was as if all the pains had found meaning at that moment. Not because they disappeared, but because they stopped defining me. My skin was clear, yes. But the true healing was not visible. It was invisible, internal, intimate. The wound I had carried in my chest since adolescence was now healing. There were still marks, but now they didn't scream. They just existed as part of my story. I arrived home and reopened my journal. I flipped through the old pages with a knot in my throat. All versions of me were there. The one who wanted to give up, the one who resisted, the one who believed against all odds. I wrote just one sentence. Today I was seen by heaven and by science. And I closed the notebook with still trembling hands. The cycle was complete. But something in me still needed time to understand everything. Because when the pain goes away, the emptiness it occupied also needs to be healed. My skin was clear. But my heart, not yet. The news spread slowly through the office, as silent changes often do. No one asked directly, but the glances shifted. From judgment they turned to admiration. The smiles that once seemed condescending now came full of respect. Mr. Davis called me into his office and said he would like me to speak at the next meeting. You went through something important. And you overcame it. I almost refused. But something inside me urged me to say yes. On the morning of the presentation my hands were cold, but my heart was firm. I looked at my colleagues with clear eyes, free from the shadow of before. I spoke about persistence without intimate details but with truth. I spoke of the process, not the miracle. Because the miracle, I learned, is what happens within when you decide to keep going. When I finished, the silence was broken by sincere applause and discreet tears. Mr. Davis greeted me with a contained nod, but in his eyes there was pride. Not the kind you have for results but for the journey taken. I left the room with the feeling that something had shifted within me. For years I avoided being seen. Now being seen was different. I no longer needed to hide. My skin was no longer a wall. It was a window. It was proof that pain and beauty can coexist. As I sat at my desk I realized, it wasn't about the skin. It was about the voice. About finding the courage to use it. And for the first time speaking didn't hurt. This time my voice didn't tremble. Days later I received an unexpected visit. Rachel arrived early in the morning, with downcast eyes and a hesitant voice. She asked to talk. We sat at the kitchen table like two different versions of ourselves. She took a deep breath before saying she was wrong, that she used harsh words even though she meant well, and that perhaps she had judged what she never had to face. Her words came without defense, just truth. It was strange to hear that from her mouth, but not painful. It was as if something that had always been out of place had finally adjusted. Rachel held my hand firmly and said, "I was afraid." And I spoke of fear as if it were faith. That touched me more than any apology. I knew how difficult it was for her to admit fragility. Seeing that there, before me, was liberating. I replied calmly. I said I had already forgiven her even before hearing the words. Because I understood that everyone loves as they have learned. And Rachel, with all her strictness, also loved me. She just didn't know how. The conversation was brief but intense. We said goodbye with a long hug. For the first time there was no weight of religion or guilt between us. There was just reconciliation. After she left, I sat alone in the living room and cried. But it wasn't sadness. It was relief. As if I had released space within me for the new. Forgiving was also part of the healing. A few days later I went to visit Pastor Elijah. Meeting him in that quiet church was already a part of me. I sat on the same pew as always and waited. He arrived smiling, looking at me with that way he has of seeing beyond appearance. Even before I told him what happened he already knew. The signs were there, he said. And he added, "Not every answer comes with an explanation. Sometimes it comes with transformation." We talked for hours without rushing. I told him about the changes, the doubts that still remained, the fear that sometimes returned at night. He listened to me as always, with that peace that doesn't need words to be transmitted. He said that the spiritual process doesn't always have logic, but it always has purpose. And that sometimes God answers in a silent but irresistible way. Healing, he said, is the beginning, not the end. I returned home feeling light. As if the weight of months had dissolved with that conversation. I felt that I no longer needed proof. What happened was real because it changed something within me. What was once pain turned into testimony. What was once shame turned into a seed. And now it was time to move forward. Not like someone fleeing but like someone blossoming. The journey continued. Only now without fear of looking ahead. I looked in the mirror before sleeping. For the first time I saw neither beauty nor defect. I saw presence. I saw truth. And I saw a whole woman. For the first time I saw myself whole. Now, I'm curious about you who heard my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you experienced something similar? Support the channel by subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing this video. I'm leaving another story on the final screen that you'll also enjoy. and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until the next video.